I am truly delighted, colleagues, to introduce to you the keynote speaker of this morning. May I just please ask if Tolu is connected and if you can hear us, Tolu.
I'm here. Can you?
Yes, we can. Colleagues, this is Professor Tolullah Oni. Allow me to provide a slightly more formal introduction of our keynote speaker today. Tolu is Clinical Professor of Global Public Health and Sustainable Urban Development at the University of Cambridge and founder CEO of UrbanBetter. She's Extraordinary Professor and Chair at Innovation Africa at UP at University of Pretoria and Honorary Professor in Public Health at the University of Cape Town. She completed her medical training at the University College London, a master's degree in public health at University of Cape Town, and a doctorate in epidemiology from Imperial College London. She has been profiled in many extraordinary journals, is a 2019 World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, a Fellow of the International Science Council and the African Academy of Sciences, past co-chair of the Global Young Academy, and also of the South African Young Academy of Science, where I'm very pleased, all of you remember, where we met for the first time. So not so young anymore, but we were young once. She was a 2015 Next Einstein Forum Fellow and a 2020 Next Generation Foresight Practitioner Fellow. Her global practice is grounded in science-informed, Africa-led participatory approaches to generating new knowledge that supports partnerships between science, policy, and societal role players. She's passionate about identifying creative strategies to address complex urban population and planetary health challenges in rapidly growing cities globally. Colleagues, it's really our extraordinary pleasure to welcome Tolu to this African Young Scientist and Graduate Conference. We look forward to your remarks. Tolu, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Strudel, and it's an honor and privilege to be here. I'd like to first start off by acknowledging the Vice Chancellor of the University of Mpumalanga, Professor Dr. Kiso. Thank you for hosting this, and I'd also like to recognize the organizing partners of the conference and say, as the previous speakers did, all of the protocols duly observed. It's a real delight to be here. I don't know how I don't not engaged in this space previously, and when I heard it was the 19th, I thought that's a really phenomenal achievement. So I'm just going to share somewhat of the cuff remarks with you a little bit today. I'll talk a little bit about my journey as a researcher and how I have applied my research and training in different spaces. I'll reflect a little bit on the opportunities that have emerged and a little bit on what the opportunity is for, I think, from my perspective, for the continent and the roles for early career researchers, but also universities and funders alike. I want to say that I will anchor my my talk on 7 key reflections, right? So I think a lot of what you hear me talk about will be based on key reflections, and these are things that I have learned along the way. I'm going to see if I can. I'm just going to show you this for a second, and then I'm a visual learner, so I just wanted to show you what my reflections will be on. So try and commit this to memory, because different aspects of my narrative will focus on these key reflections. One of the things that Professor Strudel asked me to reflect on a little bit was what I thought were key elements for career advancement from early career researchers. And I'm not going to focus on the technical, because obviously you come from different disciplines, but these are 7 key things that I, in my journey, have have come to appreciate the importance of embracing uncertainty, of finding community, of pivoting and questioning often, of knowing and learning how to navigate the landscape within which you want to operate and make impact on, striving for coherence and convergence in the work that you do, really critically embracing of serendipity and learning and using new skills. So try and listen out for how I touch on those points over the course of the next few minutes. So how have I got here? So thank you, Aldo, for the kind introduction. I'm medically trained, so I'm a physician, and I did not intend on becoming an academic, and I still sometimes weirdly feel weird about that. And it's like, oh, is that I don't recognize it as someone. And it just really came about embracing serendipity a little bit and through finding community. So I completed my medical practice, and I always wanted to do, I thought pediatrics and I thought infectious diseases, and I was working actually in HIV in London with the NHS, and I really got interested in research from my undergraduate days when I was in medical school, because I did a kind of international health course, and that was my first exposure to research, and I really got to understand the power of getting behind the issue and really getting to understand what the issue was. Incidentally, my research then was on access to antiretroviral therapy. So this was in 2000 when, this is going to sound a little bit ridiculous, but the head of the USAID then said, we'd love to provide antiretroviral therapy for globally, but, in the third world, they don't have watches, so they can't tell the time, and they can't take antiretroviral treatment, which sounds absolutely ludicrous as it is. So at the time, Médecins Sans Frontières was providing the antiretroviral therapy in different countries across the world, including in South Africa. So my research then was looking at adherence, and spoiler alert, of course, people have long-standing ways of telling time and taking medication. So obviously, and the rest, as I say, is history, because of course now access to antiretroviral therapy is much more accessible. But that's where I got the research bug, and I actually ended up in Cape Town doing research for what I thought was going to be 12 months and ended up being 12 years. And that really came about from research that I had done as an undergraduate and got a prize for, and then got this opportunity to do some research in Cape Town. Embracing serendipity, I was working as a researcher there and speaking to somebody who ended up becoming my PhD supervisor. I was speaking to him because I wanted to get a lift, because I didn't have a car. And as I was talking to him, he said, we've got this job that's coming up. You should apply for it because you seem like a good fit. But it's for 3 years. And I thought, well, okay, well, I was supposed to be here a year, but let's just go with it. And then in 20 minutes, I had my 5 years mapped out. He said, oh, have you thought about doing a PhD? I'm like, oh, God, no. I just wanted to do research for a year and then go back to medicine. But anyway, that's how I ended up doing a PhD. And he said, oh, you're interested in public health. Do you know UCT has got a really good master's in public health? Like, no, I didn't. So I ended up doing my MPH at UCT and my doctorate at Imperial with him. And then that's kind of how it started, right? So at the time, speaking of embracing uncertainty, I wasn't sure where it was going to go. And it was a stressful time because I didn't get funding I tried and didn't get funding for my PhD. By the way, I didn't get the first 3 grants I applied to postdoctorally either. And so as a result, I was working full time. I was doing my PhD full time, and I was doing my master's full time. And I was specializing in public health with the Western Cape government full time. So this was not a choice. I just didn't get funding. So don't let any failures in that regard discourage you. Because I learned things along the way. So for a start, towards the end of my PhD, I was still seeing patients time, and my doctorate was on HIV/TB, and I realized that we were seeing these patients that also had diabetes, hypertension, and a lot of these things were coming from outside of healthcare, right? And I started asking these questions, and this comes to the question often, and don't be afraid to pivot, right? So I started asking, well, but we're treating HIV, but we're also, the same patients are getting conditions that we're not looking at, firstly, and secondly, these conditions are preventable, but preventing them requires action outside of the healthcare setting. So it requires space so they can be physically active. It requires space so a food environment that can be conducive. And started realizing, well, who's responsible for that? Well, it's urban planning, it's transport, it's, people that are not in health. And so that's how I pivoted into urban health. And that birthed a whole new series of failures. So pivoting, you're not allowed to pivot, right? So I set up, I moved to the School of Public Health at UCT, and then set up an urban health research group, but then struggled to get funding in that space because everyone says, well, you do HIV/TB. What is this about this urban health thing? What are you doing about transport? What are you doing about urban planning? This is not your track record. I was so spectacular in my failure that I wrote a Nature commentary about, and you can look that up, around the importance of letting early career researchers pivot, because that's how frustrated I was by the comments I was getting, and so I think that speaks to some of the constraints when you're pursuing impact and pursuing a question and wanting to pivot and update your skills, but sometimes faced with institutional barriers. I embraced it anyway, and so I like to say, by the way, that I go through every 5 years or so this, what I call epochs of disillusionment with academia, because I wonder, I'm here for impact. If my research is not having impact, what am I doing here? And it's a little bit of a professional existential crisis that I've now come to expect and embrace, because that helps me think about, well, how do I pivot rather than leave? How do I pivot the work that I do? How do I look for atypical partners? How do I look for opportunities that allow me to continue to lean towards the impact? And so I put my hand up to every opportunity aligned that was atypical in that space. I organized the first, or led the first urban health research group at UCT. And through that, I got involved in a global partnership. And so the point I want to make there is that importance of the networks that you make and the global partnerships. So I got involved in a global partnership consortium, including other universities on the continent and in the Caribbean and in India and in the UK, including Cambridge. And that's how a few years later, after I went on sabbatical, this opportunity arose, and that's kind of how I came back to the UK. I should mention I lived in South Africa, so South Africa is my adopted country, but I'm a Nigerian. I'm sure there's at least one Nigerian in the room, because we tend to be everywhere. And I grew up in the UK. So there's all of these global engagements and experiences are advantages, but it does mean sometimes that you fall through the cracks, right? And you don't belong anywhere. And actually, there's a space of opportunity in that. I should say, on the notion of embracing serendipity, one of the lessons that I didn't put on that slide I shared with you is the importance of not being afraid to reach out to people that you identify that do incredible work. So when I was about halfway through my spectacular postdoctoral failures, I was applying for a grant in an area where the group I was in wasn't strong, so I needed to find a mentor. And I just looked through my reference list, people that I usually cite. I found a name that commonly repeated. I Googled him and I sent an email to say, hi, can you be my mentor on this grant? And he didn't respond, and I waited a few weeks, and I Googled again and found a telephone number. and he was in the UK, and I called the telephone number, and they said, oh no, he left a few years ago. He's now somewhere in the Caribbean. So then I Googled that, and I found him, and I sent him an email, and he responded. And then we chatted, and he agreed to do it. I didn't get that grant, but that mentorship was really critical for me. It's how I ended up with a position back in that global partnership. He was the one that invited me. So again, that just don't be. I'm so blown away by how receptive random people are to people like me, just calling them out of the blue. So don't be afraid to do that. I think under the Find Your Community, really critical. One of the things that I didn't mention as a cross-cutting feature in this journey was the importance of community. Professor Struble alluded to it. The fact that I'm standing here in front of you today is because of that, because we met through the South African Young Academy of Science, the Global Young Academy, the World Economic Forum Young Scientists. The list goes on, but really important to find those people because you commiserate with each other, you encourage each other, you support and build each other, and this community are really the foundation of my partnerships today. So it's really fantastic to see this sort of initiative happening. I really want to, and I think one of the previous speakers mentioned it, it's so critical. You might be here to present your work, you might be here because your abstract was accepted, etc. But what is not spoken about is the person, if you look to your left and you look to your right, these people are the people that will come with you, right? That years later will form the basis of your partnerships and collaborations going forward. So that's a little bit of my journey. Now, in reflecting on opportunities and strategic opportunities for early career researchers, it's challenging. We live in a very fast-moving world. The goalposts are constantly shifting, but I think it's really critical that programs like this are undervalued. So technical skills are absolutely necessary, so know your trade, but not sufficient, because the goalposts are moving so quickly that whatever it is that you learn in your master's, in your PhD, even your postdoc, I'm telling you, the skills I use and the methods I use in my research today didn't have a clue about it in my PhD, certainly not in my post. I've just had to relearn and pick it up along the way, and look for new partnerships to supplement where I can pick that up. So I think the transferable skills are as important, but often overlooked. And I want to highlight two particular transferable skills. One is the importance of skills related to transdisciplinarity and knowledge co-production. So now we talk about pathways to impact. Every research has to be impactful, but all too often the skills on how to engage with these societally relevant actors, whether that's in the community or with policy actors, are implicit, right? We just assume you write a policy brief, and I saw from the pre-conference yesterday, it was great to see that you've had this training on science communication and policy briefs, but I'm just going to maybe burst the bubble a little bit. Sitting in your ivory tower and doing your research and writing a policy brief and emailing it is not going to be impactful, right? Nobody's going to read your policy brief if that's all you do, right? But instead, the skills for engaging with the society relevant actors across the whole life cycle of research is something that we don't emphasize sufficiently, or we assume that you just have to be extroverted or you just have to figure out a way to pick it up. But there are methods and approaches to that, and that's really one a skill set that is absolutely critical. And I think the second transferable skill set that's really important is around futures, right? And foresight skills and anticipation. Particularly when you're dealing with, I work at the interface of health and climate and cities. So you can imagine I'm focused on cities across the African continent. So real complexity. You know, we're dealing with lots of different sectors, really fast moving, looking down and dealing with the present, you're never going to catch up. So the skills of anticipation, the skills of strategic foresight are really, and that is from the early career researchers, that's on the policy makers, that's on the multilateral. This is going to be, I believe, even more critical in the world we live in today. And maybe the reason why is because when we're thinking about addressing issues that have a long time arc, right? So where maybe cause and effect are not side by side, and or dissociated in time and space, where you do something today, it takes a while to see the impact. We have to be able to, in order to achieve the coherence and convergence, which is one of the points that I mentioned, we have to be able to map out that future and work back to look at what it is that we need to be doing now and what questions we need to be asking now to move us in that direction. And again, this is not magic. There are approaches and tools to help with thinking about that. So I think it's really important that anticipation and participation are really two critical transferable skills that are needed for more transformative and innovative action. I think my final thoughts are around thinking about the potential for, what role the universities, what role funders, what role support organizations play in driving and enabling this kind of work. So just a little bit of a reflection on that. It feels like we're going through very tumultuous times, right? Lots of societal disruption, lots of uncertainty, whether it's geopolitically, whether it's environmentally, whether it is, the statistics earlier around high levels of unemployment. And I want to quote, it was an Italian Marxist philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, who is a well-known quote from him that says, "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is a time of monsters." And I know it feels that way, but I want to update that a little bit and say, actually, these times of societal disruption offers an opportunity for action and to realignment of purpose, whether it's individually or organizationally. I think it's a time for it becomes a time for monsters if that collective social imagination on transformational systems does not put into gear. And I don't believe it necessarily is a time for monsters. I think it's an incredible opportunity and moment to align and reimagine different futures that we desire, and to ensure that these transformational changes result in commitment from the public, from the private, from the natural sectors, because those are the things that need to be set in motion today. So, for example, the African Union has this Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, which is 2063 sounds like a future, but you know what, 2025 used to sound like very futuristic. In order to achieve those goals, 2063, the things that we need to do need to be set in motion today. And I want to emphasize the importance of thinking about time differently. So there is a notion of time. We normally think about time in kind of minutes and seconds and years, but there's a notion of time I like to borrow from the ancient Greek notion of kairos time. So rather than thinking about time as chronological, the notion of kairos time refers to the opportune time for transformative action. So kairos is being described as being composed of three things: exigence, which is the inherent pressure that you feel here to do something about our situation immediately. It's composed of the audience, so who are the key people that need to be playing a role, and it's composed of the constraints. So what are the external factors that address this value? So if we're going to make use of this moment of societal disruption and allow and manufacture that kairos time, we need to think about what supportive structures unearth that exigency, support the audience and the key role players, and address the constraints. And I believe that academia is very well positioned to address this constraint, but we do need to embrace more experimental structures and spaces within these institutions. What are the skills that are needed in the workforce? You know, research. I don't believe research is entirely lives only within university. We want research. We want science across society. I didn't mention that a few years ago I founded UrbanBetter, which is a social venture, because I realized that some of the work that I did, you know, I'm full-time in a professor in university, but some of the expressions of the work that I did around data-driven advocacy, around policy-informed practice, needed expression outside of academia. And so I set up a social venture, right? So what are universities doing to support that entrepreneurial space, to support recognizing that this is not an either or? I think we don't know the models and the structures of what early career researchers will need to do, and the portfolios they will need to embrace. And it's really critical that, in as much as I say to early career researchers to embrace that uncertainty, equally critical that funders, universities, and supportive institutions also embrace that uncertainty, right? In order to nurture the researchers to operate across all facets of society. So I want to finish with saying that, to remind us that Africa is global. I'm sitting in the diaspora, and Africa is in South Africa, Africa is in Kenya, Africa is across the continent, and Africa is global. We have an incredible young population. We talk about it as this dividend, but in order to fulfill that promise, we need to elevate knowledge capital to the same level as financial capital. We need all hands on deck, right? And I think in initiatives like what you're sitting in today are highly encouraging and exciting, to, if nothing else, lower that threshold of impossibility, to look at how early career researchers can connect with each other, can get equipped to find their community, to take on new challenges, to break the frontiers, not just of science and the scientific methods and evidence, but also in different ways of knowing, different ways of being, different ways of doing. And so I hope with that, you make the best of this opportunity over the next few days in what sounds like a beautiful setting. I feel a lot of regrets that I never made it to Mpumalanga in my over decade in South Africa. So I'll wait for my invitation there. But I do hope that even beyond this week, this next few days, that you continue this journey, ensuring that you are and to revisit the slide deck I just shared with you, to ensure that you are embracing uncertainty, to ensure that you are learning, finding your community, to ensure that you are pivoting and questioning, and often ensure that you are understanding and knowing the contextual landscape that you want to impact, because you cannot do that without understanding and where you want to be, to ensure you are going towards convergence, to ensure you're embracing serendipity. And I hope through my talk I've showed you how the power of that, and really critically, the skills that you are learning today, yes, learn them, but use them in ways that use them with off license, right? Ask for forgiveness and not permission, and explore and embrace that collective imagination. And so with that, thank you again, Professor Strobel, for the invitation, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the conference.
Tolo, I'm not sure if you've seen, but you literally brought down the house with your remarks. We cannot thank you enough for your insight and to so honestly share your experience. I am very pleased about the 7 perspectives or dimensions that you brought. Us that are a little older or more established, the emerging researchers, I think everyone could resonate with some aspect of that journey towards becoming an academic leader, an influencer. I'm very pleased that you emphasize the fact that this journey is non-linear. And it's the first time, actually, that I see this in this perspective and can resonate with that experience that you've brought. And it is dynamic. So one redirects continuously. And of course, it is not always easy. So your honesty also in acknowledging failure, someone who is as prominent as you, for instance. And I will forever now remember this phrase, the epoch of disillusionment, right? Because one sometimes have some idea of what the future might be, but it certainly is not as obvious or directional as that is. The two perspectives, I think, colleagues, that's really food for thought that are quite critical for us to engage with today and tomorrow, is what Professor Oni has mentioned about transdisciplinarity and knowledge co-production. The notion of impact is very high on the agenda and prominent, not only in South Africa currently, globally, I might say. And certainly, how do we navigate around that, not only in repositioning our own work and the research that we do or the impact that we see, but to discuss the idea of what impact is and what the so-called policy uptake process is. And secondly, the notion of futures and foresight, which links very well with the call, actually, that you've made on what institutional perspectives should be and how that realignment must be there continuously. Because it is not business as usual in any sense. And there is really an urgency to be engaged, to have impact, to provide opportunities. There was also the stark reality of this morning that Ms. Chauba provided in what is our reality in this country, in any other country, in terms of unemployment, inequity. And what do we do about that? But also, what is the advantage that we have in having opportunities, in creating further opportunities for ourselves? So you might have heard during the course of the morning, Tolu, that where we find ourselves currently is the ultimate destination, and it is the place to be. So we cannot wait to invite you here, and that is a standing invitation. We really want to thank you. I think it's been really inspirational, and really, again, that honesty that you brought for us to be able to see that this is not linear. There will always be challenges, but everyone strives. Would you like to make a final comment?
No, thank you, Aldo, for picking up on that, because the non-linearity, I think, is definitely the take home. I found it very frustrating earlier on when I find people who are doing incredible stuff and I ask them, how'd you get here? And then they just give me an answer that I can't follow. It's like, oh, I met this person on the bus stop and then got chatting and then now I have this. I'm like, well, how is that useful for me? But that's why I've tried to articulate it in that way. And I think one of the things I really want to leave with you is for each person in the room to think about how can I lower that threshold of impossibility? Because if we're going to take transformational action and we're going to actually look at how research can move Africa towards the future we want, that threshold of impossibility, like, oh, we don't usually do this, we can't do that. We really need to be thinking beyond what we usually do and embrace that unknown in order to identify, new boundaries and new borders. So really fantastic. I've got nothing else. I love your summary and I look forward to my invitation.
Indeed. Tolu, thank you very much. There's a virtual gift for you in the near future, and there's furious applause following your excellent contribution. Thank you indeed.